Royal Guard TACKLES Camilla's chauffeur, after finding suspicious drops in glove box. The sun had barely risen on that quiet morning near Buckingham Palace, and the streets were still somewhat empty. It was just the usual hustle of people going about their daily lives, yet there was something different in the air that day, something that would soon change everything. The air was crisp, the kind of early morning chill that seemed to hang around for only a few hours before the warmth of the day took over. The roads, usually bustling with tourists and busy Londoners, were relatively calm. For the Royal Guard, it was just another normal shift. This was a young guard, fresh out of training. His uniform was neatly pressed, his posture upright, and his attention sharp. He had spent countless hours in drills, learning every angle of the palace grounds and rehearsing his reactions to various situations. He took his job seriously, understanding the weight of the responsibility that came with it. After all, he was stationed near one of the most important places in the country, Buckingham Palace, home to the royal family. The guard had been on duty for a few hours now, keeping a watchful eye on his surroundings. There were a few blacked-out cars parked along the curb, and a few pedestrians walking by with the air of people who had no idea what kind of history took place behind the palace walls. It wasn't until he noticed the chauffeur's car that things began to take a turn. The car was sleek and polished, typical of the kind used by high-profile figures. The kind of car that didn't stand out at first glance, but to the trained eye was clearly part of a more prestigious entourage. It wasn't the car itself that caught the guard's attention, though. It was the driver, the chauffeur behind the wheel. The guard had seen him many times before, driving dignitaries and officials, but today, something was different. The chauffeur was acting strangely. The man kept glancing nervously in his rearview mirror, his hands gripping the wheel tighter than usual. Every now and then, he would make small, fidgety movements, as though something inside the car was bothering him. The guard observed this behavior from his post, unable to shake the feeling that something was off. As part of his duties, it was his job to be aware of anything unusual, no matter how insignificant it might seem at first. The car began to slow as it approached the security checkpoint near the entrance to the royal grounds. Normally, this would be a smooth, routine process, but today, the chauffeur seemed hesitant. He appeared to be fiddling with something in his glove box, a gesture that seemed innocent enough at first, but the guard was paying attention to every detail. The chauffeur's hand reached into the compartment, and there was something about the way his fingers moved that raised a red flag. The guard's instincts kicked in immediately. It wasn't just a passing feeling. Something in his gut told him that this wasn't ordinary. The way the chauffeur had his hand in the glove box, as if hiding something, was enough to make the guard suspicious. His eyes narrowed, and he began to slowly move toward the car, keeping his distance but maintaining focus. Something was wrong, but he couldn't yet put his finger on it. As the car came to a complete stop at the checkpoint, the guard's senses were heightened. The chauffeur's hand was still in the glove box, and for a moment he looked up at the guard with an expression that seemed oddly tense. He quickly closed the glove box, but not before the guard had caught a glimpse of a small vial inside. The guard's heart rate quickened. It wasn't just any vial, it looked suspicious. Too small, too hidden. The guard's training had prepared him for all sorts of situations, but this one felt different. The feeling of unease intensified, and he instinctively moved closer, positioning himself in such a way that he could quickly respond if needed. His hand subtly moved toward the radio on his belt, ready to call for backup at a moment's notice. He knew that this could be nothing, but in his position, he couldn't afford to take chances. The chauffeur seemed to notice the guard's increased proximity, and his face tightened. There was a brief moment of hesitation before he opened the window to greet the officer. "Morning," the chauffeur said, his voice slightly shaky. "Good morning," the guard replied, his voice calm but firm. "Is everything all right?" he asked, though his question was more out of instinct than genuine concern. He had to know more. The chauffeur smiled nervously, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that the guard couldn't ignore. "Yes, just a little bit of a long drive," the chauffeur replied. "I was just organizing things here, nothing to worry about." The guard nodded, but his gaze drifted once again toward the glove box. There was a slight bulge in the compartment now, which only added to his suspicion. Something was off, and the guard could feel it. He couldn't just let this go, not when it involved the safety of someone as important as the Duchess, who was due to be in the car shortly. "May I take a look inside the glove box?" the guard asked, his tone polite but unmistakably authoritative. The chauffeur froze for a second, caught off guard by the request. The guard could see his knuckles whiten as he gripped the steering wheel. It was a subtle reaction, but one that sent a clear signal to the guard that something wasn't right. "I'm sorry, but I've just organized everything. There's no need for—" the chauffeur began, but the guard didn't wait for him to finish. He stepped closer, his hand now firmly on the side of the car as he bent down to get a better view. The chauffeur seemed to stiffen, but the guard remained focused. He had seen enough. The time for questioning was over. The guard knew he had to act before things escalated further. Without warning, the guard made his move. He stepped forward, signaling for backup to be on the way, but before he could get any closer, the chauffeur's eyes widened in panic. The driver reached for the glove box once more, but this time, his hand was visibly shaking. The guard's instincts told him it was time to intervene. He stepped back, ready to make his move if the situation took a dangerous turn. The next moments felt like they happened in slow motion. The guard's heart raced as the tension between them grew. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just a random encounter, it was a potential threat, and he had to act. The chauffeur's next move would determine how things would unfold. Would it be peaceful, or would it be something far more dangerous? As the guard positioned himself, ready for any outcome, he couldn't help but wonder. What was inside that glove box? What had the chauffeur been hiding, and how far was he willing to go to protect it? The tension between the royal guard and the chauffeur grew thick in the air. Both men stood still for a moment, each silently assessing the other. The guard could see the chauffeur's knuckles tightening around the steering wheel, his face flushed with anxiety. His attempt to brush off the situation had failed, and now it seemed as though he was trying to control his nerves, hoping the guard would just walk away. But the guard wasn't about to let this go, not when he had a nagging feeling deep down that something wasn't right. The guard's eyes flicked from the chauffeur's face to the glove box, where the faint outline of something inside was just barely visible. The object in the compartment didn't belong there, and it wasn't just the guard's training that made him feel this way. It was his instinct, that gut feeling that had kept him safe throughout his service. Every part of him was telling him to proceed carefully, to stay alert, and to trust his instincts. "Can you please step out of the vehicle?" the guard asked, his voice steady but firm. It wasn't a question, it was a request that came from a place of duty. His job was to protect the royal family at all costs, and if this situation seemed off, he wasn't going to take any chances. The chauffeur looked taken aback by the command. He opened his mouth to protest, but the guard cut him off, his posture tightening as he moved a bit closer. He had seen enough hesitation to know that the situation was not as simple as it seemed. There was something in that glove box, something that the chauffeur clearly did not want the guard to see. The nervousness was obvious now, and the guard wasn't going to let it slide. "I said, step out of the vehicle," the guard repeated, his tone not harsh but unwavering. The chauffeur's face shifted. He looked like he wanted to argue, to resist, but it was clear that he understood the gravity of the situation. With a shaky breath, he unbuckled his seatbelt, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he was trying to buy himself a few more moments. The guard's eyes stayed fixed on him, watching every movement closely. With a soft click, the chauffeur opened the door, stepping out of the car. He straightened his jacket, though it did little to ease the tension that seemed to hang between them. He stood facing the guard, his head slightly lowered, not quite making eye contact, but clearly aware that he was in a difficult position. The guard had no doubt that the chauffeur was trying to calm himself, to think of some way to explain away the odd behavior. But the guard was past explanations. There was no more room for doubt in his mind. As the chauffeur stepped out, the guard moved toward the open car door, his hand resting lightly on his belt, where the radio was clipped. If things escalated, he would need to call for backup quickly, but for now, he had to maintain control of the situation. He could feel the adrenaline pumping in his veins, the sharp focus that came with the job. Every second counted. "Open the glove box," the guard commanded, his eyes fixed on the compartment. He knew it was coming to this, but now that the moment had arrived, his heart pounded in his chest. The chauffeur hesitated, his hand hovering near the glove box. The guard could see the man's chest rising and falling rapidly with every breath he took. He was clearly nervous, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached toward the glove compartment. I really don't think you need to," the chauffeur began, his voice trembling. But the guard wasn't listening. His focus was entirely on the glove box now. "Open it," the guard insisted, his voice more forceful this time. There was no more room for negotiation. The guard knew that if there was something dangerous hidden inside, they had to know what it was, and they had to know immediately. The chauffeur's hesitation was too much. The guard had to be sure. Reluctantly, the chauffeur obeyed, reaching up to open the compartment. The guard's eyes narrowed as the glove box creaked open, and there it was, the vial the guard had seen earlier. But now that it was visible, the guard saw more. There were multiple small vials, all neatly arranged inside, their contents a dark amber color. The guard's heart skipped a beat. These were not ordinary items. They looked carefully packaged, too deliberate, as if they were being concealed for a reason. The chauffeur's face went pale as the guard leaned in for a closer look. His lips parted in an almost imperceptible way, but no words came out. It was clear that he was caught, but the guard still didn't know exactly what he had stumbled upon. He had never seen anything like this before. His mind raced, trying to piece it all together, but there was no time to waste. "What is this?" the guard asked, his voice cold and direct. There was no place for small talk now. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The chauffeur swallowed hard, his eyes darting from the vials to the guard's face. His mouth opened and closed as though he was trying to find the right words, but none came. The silence stretched between them like an uncomfortable pause in a conversation that no one wanted to have. It's just," the chauffeur's words caught in his throat. The guard's patience was wearing thin. "I need to know exactly what these are." "Now," the guard pressed, his voice still steady but firm. He could feel the weight of the moment settling over him. Everything was about to change. The chauffeur glanced around quickly as though he were looking for a way out of this situation, but there was nowhere to go. The tension was so thick now that it felt suffocating. The guard stood rigid, his eyes never leaving the chauffeur, who finally seemed to realize that there was no escape. The nervousness in his expression gave way to a slight sense of defeat, and he exhaled sharply before speaking. "They're just essential oils," the chauffeur said quietly, the words almost spilling out in a rush. "I use them to calm myself down. It's been a long day, and I've been feeling stressed." The guard didn't move. He didn't react right away, unsure of whether to believe the explanation. It seemed plausible enough. After all, the small vials could very well be oils, but something about the chauffeur's voice didn't sit right with him. There was an undercurrent of panic beneath the words. "Essential oils?" the guard repeated, his voice still skeptical. "In this much quantity?" The chauffeur nodded, his face pale but more resigned now. "Yes, I've been using them for a while to help with stress. I'm sorry if it looked suspicious. I didn't think it would be an issue." The guard still didn't trust him fully, but the explanation seemed to ease the tightness in his chest. It wasn't exactly the answer he had expected, but it was plausible enough to warrant some consideration. The guard hesitated, his mind running through the possible scenarios. It wasn't what he had feared. No harmful substances, no immediate threat to the royal family, but still, something didn't sit right about how the chauffeur had acted. The guard's instincts told him there was more to the story, but for now, the situation seemed under control. "All right," the guard said finally, his voice firm but less tense. "I'll be reporting this. You're not in immediate danger, but I need to make sure the proper protocols are followed." The chauffeur nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly in relief. His earlier tension had eased, but the weight of the guard's presence still hung in the air. "Of course," the chauffeur said quietly. "I understand." As the minutes passed, the tension between the royal guard and the chauffeur remained thick in the air. The guard's mind was still racing, analyzing every detail of the situation. While the chauffeur's explanation had somewhat eased his suspicion, there was still a lingering doubt in his mind. There was something about the way the chauffeur had hesitated before speaking, the way he had looked around as if trying to find an escape route, that didn't feel right. The guard couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than he had been told. Just then, the sound of the approaching sirens broke through the silence. Backup had arrived. The guard glanced up, his eyes meeting the chauffeur's for a brief moment before he turned to signal to the officers who had arrived to assist him. The situation had escalated from a routine checkpoint stop to something much more uncertain. The guard wasn't about to let his guard down until he had confirmation that everything was truly safe. A couple of officers stepped out of their patrol cars and walked toward the guard, who quickly briefed them on what had transpired. The chauffeur remained standing beside the car, his hands at his sides, his head slightly lowered. It was clear that he was trying to remain calm, but his unease was still evident. The guard could tell that the situation had taken a toll on the chauffeur, but the question still lingered. Why had he been so defensive? What was really going on? The two officers began to inspect the contents of the glove box, carefully examining the small vials of essential oil that had caused so much trouble. One of the officers lifted a vial, holding it up to the light as though inspecting it for any hidden contents or unusual markings. The other officer glanced at the chauffeur, his expression unreadable. "Everything seems normal here," the first officer said, his voice calm but with an edge of caution. He handed the vial back to the chauffeur, who took it gingerly, as though he were afraid it might shatter in his hands. "Seems like a misunderstanding," the second officer added, turning to the guard. "Essential oils aren't illegal, are they?" The guard shook his head. "No, but something didn't sit right with me, the way he was acting. It didn't feel like an ordinary situation. And when I saw how he was behaving, I felt the need to act quickly. My responsibility is to protect, not second-guess." The second officer nodded thoughtfully. "Fair enough. You did what you had to do. It's always better to be safe than sorry." The guard didn't respond immediately. He stood there, watching as the officers talked quietly with the chauffeur, who was now looking more relaxed, though his nervous energy hadn't entirely faded. The Royal Guard still wasn't entirely convinced. There were too many unanswered questions, questions that the chauffeur had avoided answering directly. The guard took a step back, his mind replaying the events that had led up to this point. The chauffeur's behavior had been odd, to say the least. At first, the guard had assumed that the man might be hiding something dangerous. But now that the situation had calmed down, it was hard to ignore the possibility that the chauffeur might have just been overly anxious. The guard had seen anxiety before. He'd seen it in many people over the years, but this felt different. There had been a certain intensity to the chauffeur's reactions that still didn't sit right with him. As the officers finished questioning the chauffeur and began to wrap things up, the guard decided to take one more step to ensure everything was handled properly. He stepped forward again, his voice calm but firm. "I'm going to need to call in a full report. This won't be over until we've cleared everything up," he said, his eyes fixed on the chauffeur. The man looked up at him, his expression guarded but resigned. The chauffeur nodded slowly, understanding the situation was far from over. "Of course," the chauffeur said quietly. "I just want to get this all over with. I never meant to cause any trouble." The guard's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing more. The chauffeur had admitted to nothing yet, but the guard wasn't sure he could trust his words entirely. People often said what they thought would ease the situation, not always what was true. The guard had to dig deeper, had to make sure he wasn't missing anything important. Before he could speak again, one of the officers turned toward him, signaling that they were almost done with the initial check. The officer's voice was quiet, but it carried an edge of authority that made the guard pay attention. "We've checked the vials and they're exactly as he said, just essential oils," the officer said. "No other substances, but given the circumstances, we'll need to take them in for a full analysis to be sure." The guard nodded. That was the right call. While the oils didn't seem dangerous, it was always better to be thorough. He turned back to the chauffeur, who had now stepped back toward his car, his posture slumped slightly, as though the weight of the situation had drained him. "You'll need to come with us for questioning," the guard said, his voice as neutral as possible. It wasn't a threat, it was just procedure. The chauffeur glanced up, his eyes wide, but he didn't argue. "Okay," the chauffeur murmured, his voice barely audible. "I understand." The officers made the necessary arrangements, and a police vehicle soon arrived to take the chauffeur to the station for further questioning. As the man was escorted away, the guard watched silently, still feeling uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, something hidden just beneath the surface. But for now, the immediate threat had passed. As the royal convoy was cleared to continue its route, the guard stood still, his hand resting lightly on his belt. His mind was still racing, turning over the events of the morning. He had done his job, had responded quickly and efficiently, but he couldn't help but feel unsettled by the entire encounter. There was something about the chauffeur's behavior, the way he had looked so anxious, the way he had avoided direct answers that made the guard question the true nature of the situation. And as the convoy rolled away with the Duchess of Cornwall safely inside, the guard remained on duty, his eyes scanning the streets around him. The duty of a royal guard was never done, not truly. It wasn't just about protecting the royals. It was about remaining vigilant, staying alert for any hint of danger, no matter how small. And though the immediate threat had been handled, the guard knew that his watchful eyes would never stop searching for the next sign of trouble. The morning had now given way to the afternoon, and the royal guard remained on high alert, though the tension of the previous encounter still lingered in his mind. The chauffeur was now in police custody, being taken in for questioning, and the immediate danger to the royal family had been avoided. But the questions still remained. What had happened? Why had the chauffeur acted so suspiciously? And what exactly had been in the vials he had tried to hide? As the convoy continued on its route without incident, the guard's thoughts wandered, replaying the scene over and over again in his mind. He had followed procedure, done what was required of him, but something didn't feel entirely right. While the chauffeur had insisted that the vials contained nothing more than harmless essential oils, the guard couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. He knew his role was to secure the area, not to interrogate people or dig deeper into matters beyond his scope. But he was also human, and his curiosity had been piqued. The more he thought about it, the more the chauffeur's behavior seemed out of character for someone in his position. Was it just nerves, or was there something hidden behind his actions that hadn't been uncovered yet? The guard had already called in his report to his commanding officer, detailing everything that had happened and all of his observations. It was now up to the detectives to handle the investigation, but the guard still couldn't quite let go of the unsettling feeling that had taken hold of him. He'd been on enough patrols to know when something wasn't quite right, and this situation wasn't just about a driver carrying a few bottles of oil. His thoughts were interrupted when his phone buzzed in his pocket. The text message came from his superior officer. It read simply, "Report to the station for an update on the case. They need your statement." The guard took a deep breath. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore. His involvement in the investigation was becoming more personal, and he knew that once he stepped into the station, he would be asked to provide a full account of everything he had seen and heard. As much as he had followed protocol, there were still too many uncertainties. The officer's message was clear. This wasn't just going to be a quick formality. The guard headed to the station, his steps steady but his mind racing. He arrived at the station a short while later, walking into the familiar setting of the police headquarters. Inside, there was a quiet sense of urgency. Officers moved briskly between desks, phones rang, and a sense of professionalism filled the air. It was a stark contrast to the quiet of the palace grounds, but here, too, everyone was focused on their task. He was led into an interrogation room where two detectives were waiting. One was a middle-aged man with sharp eyes, the kind of person who could read a room in an instant. The other was a younger woman, her face calm and collected, but with a sharpness to her that hinted at her experience. The older man stood up when the guard entered, his gaze never leaving the young officer's face. "Good afternoon," the man said, his voice smooth and professional. "We're just going to ask you a few questions about the incident this morning. We appreciate your quick thinking, but we need to get a clearer picture of what happened." The guard nodded, keeping his posture straight. "Of course, sir. I'm happy to help however I can." The younger detective gestured to a chair and invited the guard to sit. The room was small, but it was quiet, ideal for a serious conversation. The guard took his seat and braced himself for what was about to come. "Tell us what you saw when you first approached the chauffeur's vehicle," the older detective asked, his voice steady and probing. "Start from the beginning." The guard exhaled slowly, gathering his thoughts before speaking. "When I first saw the vehicle, I didn't think much of it. It was just another royal transport, routine. The chauffeur seemed a little nervous at first, but it wasn't anything that raised immediate concern. I've seen people a little anxious before, especially when they're close to the royal family." He paused, remembering the first sign that had set off the alarm in his mind. "But when I approached the car, he started acting odd." He kept glancing in his rearview mirror, and his hands were fidgeting. I could tell something was bothering him. He was reaching into the glove box, and it didn't look right. It wasn't the usual movement you'd expect from someone just trying to grab a map or some paperwork. The detectives exchanged glances, making notes. The younger detective leaned in slightly, her expression serious. "Go on," she urged. I couldn't see exactly what was in the glove box at first, but I noticed something shiny, something that caught my eye. It didn't look like a typical item. I asked the chauffeur to step out of the car, but he hesitated. He seemed like he didn't want to comply, and that's when I decided I needed to check things more thoroughly. The guard's voice remained calm, but the details of the encounter were starting to flood back. His mind replayed every moment, every subtle move the chauffeur had made. "Then you asked to open the glove box," the older detective interrupted. "What did you see?" "The vials," the guard replied, his brow furrowing. There were several small vials inside. They were neatly arranged, but there was something about them that didn't sit right. They were too carefully placed, like they were hidden on purpose. That's when I knew something wasn't just right. "And when you asked him about it, what did he say?" The guard's eyes focused on the table in front of him. "At first, he seemed nervous, but then he said they were just essential oils. He claimed they were for stress relief, something to help him relax during the drive. I didn't buy it. The way he hesitated, the way he looked around, it didn't feel like a simple answer. There was something more." The detectives listened carefully, nodding as they processed the guard's words. The younger detective looked up from her notebook, meeting the guard's gaze. "Do you think he was hiding something? Do you believe him?" she asked, her voice steady but searching. The guard hesitated. "I don't know. There's a part of me that wants to believe him, but something about the whole situation doesn't add up. I've been on enough calls to know when people are hiding something. His behavior, the way he was acting, it wasn't just anxiety. It was like he was afraid of being found out." The older detective spoke again. "We'll need to send those vials for testing to make sure they're what he claims they are. But for now, it's clear you did your job and you followed protocol. You acted on instinct, and that's something we appreciate." The guard nodded, but his mind was still racing. He had followed his instincts, but the truth still eluded him. He didn't feel satisfied. It wasn't just about the oils. It was about why the chauffeur had been acting the way he had. "Do you think he'll confess to anything else?" the younger detective asked, raising an eyebrow. The guard leaned back in his chair, considering her question. "I don't know. But I think the more we dig, the more we'll uncover. There's always more beneath the surface." The detectives exchanged another look. "We'll keep you updated on the progress of the investigation," the older detective said. "Thank you for your time. You've been more helpful than you know." The guard stood up, giving a brief nod. "I just want to make sure the truth comes out. If there's anything more, I'll be ready." As he left the interrogation room, the guard couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The mystery of the chauffeur's actions, the vials, and the hidden tension would haunt him until the case was closed. For now, though, he had done his part. The investigation was in the hands of the detectives, and he had to trust them to get to the bottom of it. The next few days passed slowly for the Royal Guard. The usual routine continued, patrolling the palace grounds, keeping an eye on the royal convoy, ensuring that everything was in order. But the events surrounding the chauffeur never fully left his mind. Every time he stood at attention, his thoughts drifted back to that moment. The way the chauffeur had acted, the vials in the glove box, and the uneasy feeling that had lingered even after the immediate danger had been resolved. He had done his job. He had followed procedure. And yet there was something inside him that felt unsettled. His instincts had led him to act swiftly, but even now, a part of him wondered if he had overreacted, if he had taken the situation too far. Could the chauffeur have been telling the truth all along? Was it really just a simple case of nerves, or had he been hiding something darker? These questions gnawed at him, though he knew that the answers were beyond his control. Despite the lingering doubt, the guard felt a certain sense of pride in how he had handled the situation. He had been vigilant, he had trusted his instincts, and he had acted decisively. That was his duty. The royal family's safety was his responsibility, and he had to be prepared for anything, even when things didn't make sense. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that sometimes being a royal guard wasn't just about protecting the royals from threats that were obvious. It was about being able to read the smallest signs, to notice the subtle shifts in behavior that could indicate a potential danger. His training had taught him to be cautious, to never let his guard down, but it had also taught him the importance of discretion. There was a balance between acting quickly and jumping to conclusions. While he didn't regret his actions, he knew that he had to find a way to move forward with a clearer understanding of what had happened. It wasn't long before the detectives had contacted him with an update. The vials had been tested, and much to the guard's relief, they had contained nothing more than harmless essential oils. There were no dangerous substances, no hidden chemicals, no harmful agents, nothing that posed any threat to the royal family or the public. The chauffeur's story checked out, and it seemed that the whole situation had been a misunderstanding. The oils, the nervous behavior, and the unusual actions in the glove box were all part of a larger picture of stress and anxiety, not of criminal intent. The chauffeur, after being thoroughly questioned and cleared, had been released. The police had no further reason to detain him, and while the incident had been an unfortunate distraction, it hadn't turned into the scandal that the guard had feared it might. The chauffeur's only crime had been trying to calm his nerves with essential oils, but his behavior had made it look like he was hiding something more sinister. In hindsight, it was clear that the chauffeur had been acting out of stress, not malice. Still, the royal guard couldn't fully shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. Yes, the oils were harmless, but the way the chauffeur had acted, the nervous glances, the hesitation, the way he had tried to keep the glove box closed, couldn't just be written off as anxiety. There was something about that interaction that didn't feel entirely honest. But as much as he wanted to dig deeper, he knew that he had done everything he could within his role. The rest was up to the police and the investigators. The next time the guard saw the chauffeur, it was at the palace gates. The man was back in his usual role, driving dignitaries to and from the royal family's events. His face was neutral, but the guard could see the subtle weariness in his eyes. The chauffeur had been through a lot, and despite everything being cleared up, the guard wondered if the man would ever truly feel the same. The encounter was brief. The chauffeur didn't look at the guard directly, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. The guard gave him a nod of acknowledgement, and the chauffeur returned a slight, almost imperceptible smile. There was no need for words. Both men knew what had happened, and neither of them was in a position to change it. The guard, for his part, couldn't help but reflect on the nature of his job. He was trained to protect, to respond to threats, to stay alert at all times. But there was no training for the moments when the line between instinct and doubt blurred, when the choice to act or wait felt like a gamble. What if he had been wrong? What if he had misread the signs? What if he had overreacted and caused more harm than good? But that was part of being a royal guard. He wasn't always going to have all the answers. He wasn't always going to know whether he had made the right call. But he had to trust his instincts, trust that his training had prepared him to handle whatever came his way. In the end, that was all he could do. As the days passed, life returned to normal at the palace. The events of the incident began to fade into the background, a distant memory in the grand scheme of things. The chauffeur continued to drive, the royal guard returned to his posts, and the royal family went about their duties. But for the guard, the lesson of the incident stayed with him. It wasn't just about protecting the royals. It was about understanding the weight of his decisions, the consequences of his actions, and the need to remain vigilant, no matter how small the threat might seem. In the quiet of the palace grounds, as the guard stood watch once again, he felt a sense of resolution. He had done what was required of him, even when it hadn't been easy. He had followed his instincts, and though the situation had turned out to be harmless, he couldn't help but feel that it was a reminder. Being a royal guard wasn't just about responding to threats. It was about keeping watch, staying alert, and being ready for whatever the day might bring. And as he looked out over the grounds, his mind finally settled. He had done his part, and now all he could do was trust that the rest of the story had been written with the right outcome.